discretion is advised.
What are some solved mysteries? In January of 1993, a 14-year-old girl I went to high school with was abducted on her way to school, murdered, and left nude in a ravine. Her murder went unsolved until 2004, when advances in DNA technology linked her case to a man who was already in prison for killing another woman. Turns out he was a serial killer who had killed 4 women, some of whom had been raped. There once was an urban legend conspiracy theory about a video game called Polybius. The story goes as such a mysterious arcade cabinet appeared in Portland, Oregon in 1981 with never before seen gameplay. It was captivating to the point of addicting. But that's not all. Many who played the game fell sick or went mad. Some versions of the myth detail that it caused hallucinations and nightmares or drove players to suicide. Every version of the urban legend mentioned mysterious men in black who would check on the game every now and then, leading some to believe this was some kind of government psyop to make people go insane. Several times over the years, it was proven to have not existed, usually by pointing to lack of contemporary media coverage and/or an FOIA request that found no records of such a video game. But this left people unsatisfied. If it truly were a psyop, of course these channels would come up blank. It wasn't until a retro gaming YouTuber and journalist called Ahoy, who is a god tier YouTuber by the way, made a video detailing his investigations. He not only proved it to be false, he found the exact person, place, time, and purpose for which the rumor was created. Check the video here link. Honestly, one of my favorite watches on it and possibly my favorite documentary ever made. This guy's investigation is captivating and goes into an insane amount of detail. The disappearance of Antoine de SaintExupery, author of The Little Prince, who was also a French reconnaissance pilot during World War II. In 1944, he took off on a reconnaissance mission from Corsica and never made it back, and there was never any evidence of what might have happened to him and his plane. Finally, in 1998, a French fisherman pulled up his net and found wrapped in it a silver bracelet engraved with SaintExupery's name. And in 2004, a diver searched in the area and found the remains of his plane, which had apparently been shot down by a German fighter after all. The murders of Jay Cook and Tana van Cuylenborg, a couple from Victoria, because went on a short trip to Washington State in 1987 and were murdered. It remained unsolved until 2018 when a genetic match from the semen found on Tana was found. The story was of interest to me as I live in Victoria and remember the story on the news when the murder happened when I was a young kid. Between 2010 and 2015, I actually worked with her younger brother. He grew up and became a lawyer. Very nice guy, and was so happy for him when they announced it was solved. 100 years ago, Viking bones from one of the most important grave finds in Denmark disappeared from the Museum of National History. They were found last week in a box, seemingly misplaced among elements from a different find. The Windsor Hum. Residents of Windsor, Canada have been saying they could hear a hum coming from across the river in Detroit for the better part of a few decades. Well, turns out that when a steel producer turned their furnaces off recently when they were closing up shop, the hum stopped. People had no idea what the noise could be until the factory closed. Edit. Also a little fun fact: Zug Island, where the factory was located, was mentioned in Robocop and was also the destination of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald before it sank. Devil's Kettle Falls. A stream separates into 2 sections. One continues normally, the other spirals deep into a hole. All sorts of things were thrown down the hole in an effort to discover where the water went. Ping pong balls, various dice. It was even rumored that someone stuck an old car down there. Eventually someone came up with a clever idea. They measured the total water flow above and below the falls and discovered they were similar enough to deduce the 2 streams joined back up relatively quickly. Forrest Fenn's hidden treasure chest that he buried years ago and left clues to where to find its location. It was found within the last 2 years, I think. Here's a link to an article better explaining it. Dan Rather was attacked and beaten on a New York street by two men who kept demanding, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" He was rescued by a doorman, and the two guys got away. For years, no one knew who they were. Then a man invaded NBC studios and killed a stagehand. When captured, he explained that the networks were beaming radio messages into his head. He wanted to know the frequency they were using, so he could jam the signals. Dan Rather was shown a mugshot and positively identified his attacker. The case of Adrienne Shelly, screenwriter for Waitress. Husband came home to find her hanging in the shower, ruled suicide. He insists she was happy and would never kill herself, promoting another view of crime scene, where they found a shoe print that matched a construction worker in the building. Sure enough, the construction worker went to rob her and thought he killed her, so staged a suicide when the hanging ended up being the actual thing that killed her. Another science mystery. Back in the 1800s, evolution theorists had predicted the age of the Earth to be several milliard years, since this would have been necessary for the current life forms to have evolved. But Kelvin, the #1 superstar of physics at the time, had used thermodynamics to calculate the age of the Earth based on the temperature of its insides, and he said it was quite a bit younger. This was a mystery for many years and was considered one of the major flaws of then current evolution theory. It was not until the early 1900s they found the answer: radioactivity. Decays of uranium and other radioactive element are heating up the Earth, so the cooling takes longer than expected. The biologists were right all along. But when the scientists who made the discovery were about to present their findings, who's sitting at the back of the lecture room? It's Kelvin. Now an old man. He's still alive and has come to watch their presentation. They were terrified at the idea of having to stand in front of the Lord of Physics himself and basically explain why he was wrong. But to their great relief, he immediately fell asleep. I think about this when I myself fall asleep in physics class. It happens to the best of us. Coincidentally, just today I listened to a podcast on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe explaining that the often told and widely accepted story of Lord Kelvin's mistaken calculation being due to the unknown effect of nuclear decay is untrue. It turns out the heating of the Earth due to radioactive element only account for less than 1% of the measured heat flux escaping through the Earth's crust, an important measurement in Kelvin's calculation. His mistake was in assuming the Earth was a solid sphere. Benjamin Kyle, man found beaten behind a Burger King with severe amnesia. It was a fascinating mystery until it was solved. Then it was kind of sad. He had made TV appearances, had a couple of Amazon Reddit, but no one could identify him. When his identity was discovered, William Burgess Powell, there was still a 20-year gap in his life from 1984 to 2004. There's no record he had done anything. He had distanced himself from his family and had no friends, which is why no one recognized or identified him from his TV appearances. 1947, and British South American Airways aircraft named Stardust disappeared. Its last message was simply Stendek. After an exhausting search, no trace of the aircraft was found. 4 years conspiracy theories and talk of alien abduction by wackos circulated, till 1998, when mountain climbers on a remote mountain found an engine, pieces of metal, and clothing at the bottom of a glacier on the side of Mount Upungato. Turns out the aircraft got caught flying the wrong way in the jet stream while it was flying at night, and using a system of timing when to start their descent. Being in the jet stream reduced their airspeed in relation to the Earth, and they smacked themselves straight into the side of a mountain, after which an avalanche covered the wreckage. The wreckage took decades to flow down the side of the mount with the glaciers. The glacier preserved the wreck so well that 50 years later the recovery team found identifiable remains, personal items, and could read serial numbers on the engines. Amazing, one of the landing gear tires was still inflated, and that teams continued to visit the site for periodically as more of the aircraft, cargo, and remains of passengers are still emerging from the ice. The Solway Spaceman. In 1964, Jim Templeton, a fireman from the English city of Carlisle, was spending an afternoon out with his family when he snapped a photograph of his young daughter without much thought. But when he got home and had the film developed, he noticed what has now become known as the Solway Spaceman. The photo shows what many people say is a person in some form of spacesuit. Kodak even analyzed the photo and their experts said it was authentic, lending to the spaceman theory. The spaceman was his wife with her back to the camera. He was only able to see 70% of the frame and didn't realize his wife was in the background of the picture. What inaugirus looked like. When I was a kid in the 80s, all that was known were the bones of the arms with enormous claws, hence its name. Terrible hand. They were mostly shown grasping a small car because they were so freaking huge. The rest of the animal was a complete mystery. Was it like a giant allosaurus? One that'd make T-Rex look like a puppy in comparison. A few years later it seemed more likely to be ostrich-like and an omnivore. Either way, given how rare it is for fossils to form at all, I was convinced I'd die never knowing what this dinosaur actually looked like. Then surprisingly in 2014, they found more bones, and it was just the weirdest thing. There was one of these dogs mysteriously jumping off of a certain bridge to their deaths. They thought there was some demon that possessed them to make them kill themselves. It was looked into and discovered that the dogs could smell some creature that lived below the bridge, so they wanted to chase it down because the bridge wall was so high and behind the bridge was a lot of foliage that the dogs from their level couldn't perceive that there'd be a drop on the other side. What happened to the '68 Ford Mustangs used in the Steve McQueen movie Bullitt? For decades car enthusiasts and Mustang fans wondered if they were still around somewhere or had been crushed like a lot of movie cars. Fortunately both were found. One ended up in a junkyard in Mexico and was turned into an Alina replica. The other one, the stunt car, if I remember correctly, was garaged by its owners since the 80s after some mechanical problems. The Adrienne McDonald case. She and her husband Andre, yes. Adrienne and Andre originally were from Jamaica. They moved up to my town in Texas, where Andre was Air Force and Adrienne was a bodybuilding business owner. Andre was pretty jealous that Adrienne was more successful and was constantly demanding that she make him co-owner of her company. She always said no. One day he had it and did away with her. The gym that she frequented every single morning got concerned when she stopped showing up. She was very close with the ladies that she worked out with and even gave them a key to her house. She told them that if she ever went missing, that her husband probably did it, and they knew he had an attitude. So one day, while Andre was out, the ladies went to check on Adrienne. Her car was there, her wallet was there, but she wasn't. They found blood and hair in her bathroom. That's when cops were called. Cops showed up when Andre was home and asked about Adrienne. He said she was in the hospital. They asked him, if she's in the hospital, how come her wallet's here? He responded, simply, talk to my lawyer. They got a warrant and were able to search the house further. Saw more leftover evidence in the bathroom, and evidence of clothes had been found burned in the fire pit in the backyard, but no body. So all they could do was charge him with a missing persons deal. Andre was super snarky about it too. How he'd be proven innocent. How the cops would never catch on. Little did he realize how loved Adrienne was, and how much Texas ranchers hate corrupt and snarky murderers. Crowds gathered daily and were given permission to sweep over ranchers' land for any sign of Adrienne's body. Just as crowds started feeling defeated and Andre started to see hope of being released, a rancher was scoping his field. He had heard coyotes out and went to see what could have enticed them. Sure enough, he found human bones, later identified as Adrienne. So yeah, proper charges were able to be filed. Add on. So some ask why she stayed or why he felt jealous that she was more successful. Remember, they are from Jamaica. The whole point of coming here was to better themselves and bring pride to their families. So she was doing great, but because she was doing so good, his family was kind of looking down on him because his wife was better, more successful than him. And then she stayed with him, mainly because she wanted to try and make sure their daughter's life could be as normal as possible. Sucks that kind of backfired for her, but now she's being taken care of by her aunt and grandma who both love and support her. This is a personal family mystery that got solved a few years ago. So nothing exciting that would have gotten media attention. Haha. But my maternal great-grandmother once ran away from home to the big city and came back pregnant. She refused to disclose anything about the father. Either way, even down to my generation, we have had unusually shaped feet, rather flat, with a strange angle, and it has made most regular shoes uncomfortable. It's not so bad for me. I take physically more after my paternal side of the family, but my brother and mother have it really bad. So does my cousin, who ended up seeking the help of a physical therapist. The therapist said that her feet are truly unusually shaped and referred her to a specialist doctor who's an expert on feet. Apparently that's a thing. The doctor examined her feet and said that the only place in the world with distinct feet like that is a certain county in France, with winemakers who have been stomping on grapes for centuries. He said that he is 99% certain that the feet come from there, that we must have close family lineage from there. My cousin told our family, and we were very confused. We most certainly don't have French relatives, until we realized great-grandma, the city she ran away to, was known to house traveling craftsmen from all over the world. She must have hooked up with a French winemaker. We joked that now she rolled over in her grave because this strange feet doctor discovered her secret. Jesus and the Land of Tar. A few years ago, 2017, comedian Nate Fernald posted a tweet of an enamel pin he had bought of a familiar looking friendly monster with the word Jesus written under it. He was unable to find any information on what Jesus is, and the mystery took the internet by storm. The mystery kept growing as someone found a sticker of Jesus alongside other characters all listed as the Land of Tar. The sticker sheet was from a company called Denison. There were no Google results at all for either Jesus or the Land of Tar. With multiple people researching, that was where the mystery was left off, and people kind of forgot about it. But a couple years later it was solved. A podcast was made where they investigated the mystery, got a hold of the former art director of Denison back in the 80s who referred them to a few potential artists, and they found the daughter of one of the artists who had passed away, and in her father's stuff was the original pencil drawings of the creatures of the Land of Tar. It was never anything but those stickers. This internet mystery still appeared on lists for a while as unsolved. The only mystery left is who made the enamel pins, which is still a mystery, but not quite as big as who is this character and this land that seems familiar, but that there's no record of. I have one that most people seem to not know about. Grand Duchess Anastasia was in fact killed with the rest of her family in 1918. She never escaped, and the several women throughout the 20th century claiming to be her lead. The site of the execution of the Tsar and his family was completely untouched until 1991. Excavation found only 9 of the 11 expected remains. It wasn't until 2007 that 2 further sets of remains were found a small distance away from the previous grave site. DNA testing found that one of the sets of remains belonged to Tsarevich Alexei and the other to one of his sisters. With this find, it proved conclusively that the entire imperial family was in fact executed and buried in 1918. Sarah Yarborough was a teenager a few doors down who watched over us on several occasions when we were young kids. She was murdered and dumped in a bush at the high school like a piece of trash, and it was absolutely devastating. It wasn't a small town, but when it happens to your neighbor, it is very much in your sphere of awareness. Everyone was scared. I remember the media circus at the home, the eventual tapering off of said circus, and the family moving away to get away from the undoubtedly bad memories and constant reminders their kid was murdered and the killer was still out there and on the loose. It turned into a cold case. Every now and then, I looked for news of an update, even though I grew up and moved away. I did this for years, decades even, because it always bothered me as an early childhood memory. A couple years ago, I finally saw a local news report that DNA evidence and genealogy databases led to the arrest of the murderer. For me, that was an emotional moment of getting closure, and I can't imagine the magnitude of emotions and fresh wounds felt by the parents having learned that nearly 30 years later, the investigation on the cold case paid off. In 1981, A Soviet submarine ran aground in Swedish waters. This was a huge deal, although the Soviets claimed the sub was in distress and didn't purposefully enter Swedish waters. Basically everyone in Sweden saw it as evidence that their waters were being invaded by spy subs. Plus, they did some snooping of their own and determined that the sub was emitting radiation, meaning it had nukes on board. So they went along with the Soviets' clearly false claim about an accident and helped get the sub out of there. But panic was in the air, so the Swedes did exactly what you'd expect, and they prepared for more Soviet subs. I mean, when you see one Soviet sub, surely there are more, right? So Sweden developed advanced acoustic technology to detect subs, and they created a plan to basically seal off their waters when they heard a sub. And wouldn't you know it, a year later, they found a Soviet sub. Well, they didn't find it, but they absolutely heard it, and they cut off the bay and figured they just had to hunt the sub down. But after a month, they couldn't find it. They gave up and reopened the bay, but they assumed the sub found a way out. But they'll get it next time. And then it happened again, but they couldn't find it again. And then again and again with no clear pattern for a decade. What the heck? Thankfully, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. So, no more subs. Right. Neat. Because the Russian subs were still coming. Wait. What? Okay. So now nothing is making sense. At this point, the Swedish military brought in outside experts to figure out what was happening. This included oceanographer types who were obvious experts in the surrounding waters. The military then played the audio evidence of the Soviet submarines, only to be told they weren't submarines at all, they were fish. And the propeller-like sound was water being released from their swim bladders. And that's the story of how the Swedish military spent 10 years and tens of millions of dollars chasing fish farts. Fast radio bursts, or FRBs. First discovered in 2007. It's a radio pulse a few milliseconds long, typically coming from extragalactic sources. In April of 2020, the CHIME radio telescope found the first one recorded in the Milky Way. The source was a magnetar, a highly magnetic remnant of a large dead star. Magnetars are a special kind of neutron star because they have such an intensely strong magnetic field. If a magnetar was a moon's distance away, it would be able to rip your car keys out of your pocket. What causes these FRBs is a magnetar quake. Magnetars are so dense that the surface is under a lot of strain to collapse in toward the core, but the physical density of the neutron star is holding it back. A very slight shift in the crust of the magnetar releases a huge burst of X-rays, gamma rays along with radio waves, and that is the fast radio bursts we see. The disappearance of flight Cal 007 in the 1980s. Headed from Alaska to South Korea, the flight took off as normal, in spite of multiple systems and scanners on the plan to ensure an accurate flight path. At some point it lost contact and eventually disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. It was searched for by Korea, the US, and even Japan. No one could find anything. The flight was supposed to come close to USSR borders. The USSR refused search efforts within their borders, but offered to look themselves. Once civilian debris from the flight began washing up on Japan's shores, it was largely accepted that the plane had crashed. But why? How? The USSR claimed total innocence until they couldn't any longer. We didn't get the full story of Cal 007 until the USSR fell in the 1990s. 10 years after the crash. It was then we were able to find out that not only did they know what happened, they were responsible. It's believed 007 was given the wrong coordinates before leaving the Alaskan airport. Coordinates so wrong, they ended up way off course and actually bouncing in and out of Soviet airspace. At this time it was the middle of the night. The Soviets believed it to be a spy plane sent by the US intentionally into their airspace. 2 fighter pilots were sent to check out the foreign plane and ordered to give warning fire. At this same time, Cal 007 had requested permission from a Korean air station to fly higher to conserve fuel. It was the last contact anyone would have with them. When they went to fly up, a warning shot damaged the hydraulics that control the plane's movements. Suddenly it was shooting up and down uncontrollably. This was the only sign the pilots had that anything was wrong at all. The fighter pilots following the plane though having reported in that 007 had lights like a civilian aircraft. Transcripts show they were told to basically shoot it down anyway. When the plane began moving erratically, the Soviet fighter launched a missile that struck the back of the passenger cabin. At more than 30,000 feet, people and items were basically sucked out like a vacuum. Nothing but warped body parts and luggage was strewn across the ocean for quite some distance. Records show the pilots and plane went down a distance later, near an island off the coast. Days later a search team found what was left. The USSR decided to cover it up and pretend they had no idea what had happened. For 10 years 230 plus people's families had no idea what had happened to their loved ones. Truly awful, and I was surprised I had never heard of this case before. A civilian flight shot down by the USSR. With proof they pretty much knew it was a civilian flight and didn't care. They had all the evidence, transcripts, 2 black boxes from the plane, the crash site, everything. And they lied and kept it a secret. The Marfa Mystery Lights. Small town in West Texas has lights that can be seen dancing off the horizon in a certain spot some nights. For many years the source of the light was not known, and explanations ranged from mass hysteria to the ever popular UFO. One researcher finally figured it out. The elevation changes and desert air would occasionally combine to distort and project headlights from cars on a highway several miles away. Reports of the mystery lights from times prior to the highway or automobiles are probably campfires in the general area of the highway. Like many highways, the area was already used as a road for quite a long time. Click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.